Hey, I'm Thomas. Welcome to Pilot's Workshop. In this video I want to show you how I made a custom touchscreen pen. But before we get started, let me make you a quick sketch so that you see what I mean. The body of the pen will consist of a brass tube covered in wood. The wood will be glued to it with epoxy resin. In the front there will be a soft soldered brass insert that holds the rubber tip in the front. The rubber tip will be from a commercially available pen. It will be covered with a stainless steel cap. The end of the pen will receive a stainless steel cup as well, and it will hold the stainless steel clip. The clip will be held in position by two stainless M1.4 screws. So let's get started. The project began with a brass rod for the main body. First I cut it to length. And then I cleaned up both ends on the lathe. Next, I cut the inside thread in the back of the tube. Because of the small wall thickness of that tube of only 0.5 millimeter, I had to make a custom thread. So I ended up with an M7.5 by 0.4 thread, which is everything but not standard. Next up, the brass insert. The turning began as usual with a facing cut, followed by the shaping of the outside. Then I cut the thread on the outside of the front brass tip. Again, this is not a standard metric thread, but in this case an M7 by 0.4 thread. And already it was time for parting off. I like to interrupt the parting off halfway to just break the corner of the freshly made edge before it comes off the lathe. And then I can just continue the parting off and all edges on the part are already broken. The next step was to solder the brass insert that we just made into the brass tube. So first I applied some flux to both parts to prepare the surface. Then I melted some solder to the thin brass tube, so that I don't need 3 hands when I'm doing this. And then all I had to do was to wait for the brass insert to heat up in the flame, so that it reaches soldering temperature and would slide right into the tube. When everything was cooled off, I could put it aside to take care of the wood. Off camera, I already mixed the epoxy that I wanted to use. Then I made sure to spread it evenly on the wooden piece as well as on the brass tube. Before pushing the tube all the way in, I first kind of flossed away the excess resin so that it wouldn't get into my thread. Then I hammered it to final depth, making sure that some wood sticks over so that I can take it off later on the lathe. Then everything was set aside for curing. Next up, the cap at the back of the pan. Once again, this began with a facing cut, followed by the shaping of the outside and cutting of the thread. Then the outside was sanded in steps up to 3000 grit, followed by a polish. For now I kept the cap on the rest of the rod because it would make working on it in the next step much easier. And after pre-drilling, it was time to tap the two M1.4 threads. Given how thin this tool is, in combination with the stainless steel, this operation ended up containing more backwards movement than forward. The next piece we're making is the clip. First, I roughly cut off a strip of 1 mm stainless steel. Then I marked how wide I wanted to have it and filed it to dimension. Then I broke the edges to prepare it for the next step. Now, the stainless steel that I used for the clip is a rather soft material, so it will not jump back like a spring, but it will rather bend. So in order to use it as a clip that is durable, I have to harden it. And the only way to do it with this material is to work hard on it. And the way I'm doing it is to stretch it with a hammer. As this process goes along, you can tell how the piece toughens up with every hit of the hammer. The anvil is also a great way to shape the piece. And after some fine sanding, it was time to polish the clip. The positions of the holes were marked using the cap that we already made as a reference. With a needle file, I then hollowed out the bottom of the clip so that it would sit nicely on the cap. Finally then, the cap could be cut off from the rod to be finished off at the lathe. That's that part done. In the meantime, the epoxy from the main body had cured and it could be rounded over on the lathe. Again, I'm doing this here on the metal lathe just for safety and precision reasons. Then the front and the back side of the wood, that are still sticking over the brass tube at this point, were brought to dimension. After a second layer of epoxy that I applied on the outside had cured, I could give the handle a final polish with wet sandpaper. And so we come to the last major piece of this project, the front cap. At this point, the rod is already pre-drilled and tapped, and everything left to do is to shape the outside. After polishing, the cap could be parted off. And then screwed into the pen and reversed in the lathe to finish the tip. And now we're quickly approaching the finish line. All that's left to do is to adjust the 2 screws that are going to hold the clip. They just had to be shortened a bit because I didn't cut the thread deep enough. And that I simply did with a file. And so it's time for the assembly. For extra longevity of the pen, I added 3 extra tips in the back so they could be changed if one is broken. Because I really didn't want to risk losing the small screws, I added some Loctite. And here you can see what it looks like if you don't have an Allen key small enough for the screws you are using. Making sure that the clip behaves as wanted. And finally tightening the screws before the Loctite sets. I thought at this point it would be a good idea to see if the pen is actually working. So I was happy to see that it does. So that's it. If you liked this project, make sure to subscribe. Maybe leave a comment or even a like. Until then, see you next time. Thank you for watching.